There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being the reliable one in a family, not the loud one, not the favorite, but the one everyone assumes will simply handle things. Sophia Miller had worn that role for so long she sometimes forgot it was a role at all. At 28, she was one of the most sought-after interior designers in New York, the kind whose name appeared in the small, tasteful credits of magazine spreads rather than the bold, self-congratulatory captions of Instagram influencers. Her studio in Soho occupied the second floor of a converted warehouse, all exposed brick and soft northern light, and her client list included 2 Manhattan penthouses, a boutique hotel in the Hamptons, and, though she rarely mentioned it, the private offices of a hedge fund whose partners had specifically requested someone who understands restraint. Restraint was, in fact, the exact word people used to describe Sophia. She dressed well, but never loudly. She spoke rarely in family gatherings, and when she did, it was usually to smooth something over rather than to draw attention to herself. She had built an entire career out of making spaces feel calm, considered, and unhurried, an irony not lost on her, since her own inner life had rarely felt any of those things. Her older sister, Isabella, was the opposite in every conceivable way. Isabella was 31, worked in brand partnerships, for a mid-tier lifestyle company, whose actual function Sophia had never quite been able to explain to anyone who asked, and had built her entire identity around being the center of every room she entered. She posted constantly brunches, vacations, candid but clearly staged photos with their mother, always captioned with some version of gratitude and family devotion that never quite matched the version of events Sophia remembered living through. Their mother, Eleanor, was turning 60 that year, and had been dropping hints about the milestone since roughly the previous September. Eleanor had built her own life around appearances in a quieter, older-fashioned way than Isabella's social media performance, the right country club, the right charities, the right friends, whose husbands golfed with Robert, Sophia's father. Eleanor loved her daughters. Sophia believed that much was true, but she loved the idea of a harmonious family even more, and when the two came into conflict, Eleanor reliably chose the idea over the reality. Robert, Sophia's father, was a man who had spent 40 years as a corporate attorney and had apparently used up his entire capacity for conflict in the courtroom, because at home he had none left. He loved his daughters equally, in the abstract, distant way of a man who had never quite learned how to intervene in anything. When Isabella took credit for things she hadn't done, Robert looked at his newspaper. When Eleanor took Isabella's side without examining the facts, Robert refilled his coffee. He was, Sophia had long ago concluded, a good man who had simply decided that peace, even a false, unjust peace, was worth more to him than the discomfort of confrontation. And then there was Samuel, their grandfather, Robert's father, 84 years old and sharper than everyone else in the family combined. Samuel had built a modest manufacturing business from nothing after the war, had raised 4 children on a foundation of plain speaking and even plainer bookkeeping, and had never once, in Sophia's entire life, allowed a lie to sit comfortably in a room he occupied. He didn't intervene often. He preferred, he'd told Sophia once, to let people reveal themselves fully before he said a word. You catch more truth in silence than you ever will in an argument, he'd said. People think quiet means you're not paying attention. It means the opposite. Sophia had spent her whole life being underestimated by everyone in her family except her grandfather. This year, for her mother's 60th birthday, she had decided, quietly, without announcement, the way she did most things, to give Eleanor something extraordinary. Something Eleanor would remember. Something that had nothing to do with credit or attention, and everything to do with love expressed the only way Sophia knew how, through careful, considered, unglamorous effort. She had no idea, when she began planning, that the evening would end with her walking out into the snow. The planning had taken Sophia 4 months. She chose the venue first, a private lodge attached to one of the most exclusive resorts in Aspen, Colorado, a place with soaring timber ceilings, a wall of glass overlooking the mountains, and a chef who did not, under any circumstances, take walk-in reservations. Sophia had designed the interior of a boutique hotel 2 seasons ago for the same resort group, and it was through that relationship, a favor called in, a discount quietly negotiated, that she'd secured the private dining room at all. She built the menu herself, sitting across from the executive chef for 3 hours on a video call, discussing her mother's specific tastes, the seared scallops Eleanor had fallen in love with on a trip to the Amalfi Coast 15 years earlier, the exact style of chocolate torte Eleanor's own mother used to make, which Sophia had spent an entire weekend trying to reconstruct from a half-remembered family recipe, a wine list built around a single bottle of 2004 Napa Cabernet that Eleanor had once mentioned, in passing, 6 years ago, as the best glass of wine I've ever had, a comment Sophia had filed away and never forgotten. She flew in a string quartet from Denver. She had photographs of Eleanor's life, from childhood in Ohio through motherhood, through Sophia and Isabella's own childhoods, restored, framed, and displayed around the private dining room. She arranged for the resort sommelier to walk the room during dinner, offering small, personal stories about each wine, as it was poured, because she knew her mother loved being told the story behind things almost as much as she loved the things themselves. The total cost, when Sophia added up the venue rental, the chef's custom menu, the musicians, the wine, the framing and printing, the flowers flown in from a specific grower in California, whose peonies Eleanor had once admired at a friend's wedding, came to just over $15,000. Sophia paid for all of it herself, out of a savings account she'd built slowly and carefully over 6 years of underbilling herself relative to her actual talent, because she had never quite shaken the old family habit of not asking for too much. She told no one the total. She told no one, in fact, much of anything, not because she wanted secrecy, but because she had learned, over many years of watching Isabella operate, that announcing a gift in advance only invited someone else to attach themselves to it. She should have anticipated what would happen. She didn't. 2 weeks before the dinner, a family group text had begun circulating, Isabella, mostly, coordinating the details of Eleanor's birthday weekend, discussing flights, discussing the resort spa schedule, discussing, at one point, the surprise I'm planning for Mom's dinner, a phrase that made Sophia's stomach tighten slightly even as she told herself it was probably nothing. She had specifically not told the family group chat the scope of what she'd arranged, wanting instead for it to simply unfold as a gift on the night itself, without fanfare, without a performance of gratitude extracted in advance. She wanted her mother to feel loved, not to feel like she was watching a show about being loved. She had not counted on Isabella filling that silence with her own script. The evening of the party, snow fell steadily outside the wall of glass windows, catching the light from the string quartet's stand lamps and turning the whole mountainside beyond into something soft and luminous. 20 family members and close friends had gathered around a long table set with white linens, gold-rimmed china, and the restored photographs Sophia had arranged along a side table, each one lit by a small brass picture lamp. Sophia arrived early, as she always did, to check the details one final time, the temperature of the room, the placement of the flowers, a quiet word with the sommelier about pacing the wine service so it wouldn't rush her mother's favorite courses. She wore a simple cream-colored dress, understated, the kind of thing she always wore to events, where she'd rather the room notice the room than notice her. Eleanor arrived on Robert's arm, radiant in deep emerald green, and gasped audibly when she stepped into the dining room and saw the photographs, the flowers, the quartet quietly tuning in the corner. "Oh," she said, one hand rising to her chest, "oh, this is beautiful." For one warm moment, Sophia felt something loosen in her chest. This was exactly what she had wanted, her mother's genuine, unguarded delight. The moment didn't last. Isabella swept into the room roughly 10 minutes after Eleanor, in a dramatic burgundy gown, with her hair styled for what appeared to be a photo shoot rather than a family dinner, trailed by her boyfriend holding what Sophia would later realize was a ring light disguised, somewhat unconvincingly, as a candle-style lamp. Isabella made her way directly to the head of the table, air-kissed her mother, and without any acknowledgement toward Sophia at all, tapped her wine glass with a fork to call the room to attention before the appetizers had even been served. "I just want to say something," Isabella announced, her voice pitched to carry, her eyes already glistening with rehearsed emotion, "before we start eating." 20 pairs of eyes turned toward her. Sophia, seated near the far end of the table, went still. Isabella raised her glass of Napa Cabernet, the exact bottle Sophia had spent weeks sourcing, the one tied to her mother's memory of "the best glass of wine I've ever had," and continued, her voice trembling with practiced sincerity. "I am so happy that I was able to put together every single detail of tonight myself, the menu, the music, all of it, for Mom. You deserve nothing but the best." The table erupted into applause. Sophia sat frozen at the far end, her hands folded in her lap, watching her mother's face light up with pride as she reached over to squeeze Isabella's hand. Watching relatives she'd known her whole life, aunts, cousins, family friends, nod approvingly at Isabella, several of them glancing toward Sophia with expressions that seemed to silently ask why she hadn't contributed anything to such a lovely evening. She said nothing. What was there to say, in that instant, that wouldn't sound petty, wouldn't sound like she was trying to steal a moment away from her mother's happiness? She had planned this dinner precisely so that her mother could feel celebrated without complication. Correcting Isabella publicly, in that moment, felt like it would only create the exact kind of scene Sophia had spent her whole life trying to avoid. So she stayed quiet. She reached for her fork instead, intending to at least enjoy the Wagyu steak that had been the single most expensive line item on the entire menu, a cut she had specifically requested from a supplier in Japan because her mother had once mentioned, on a trip to Tokyo years ago, that she'd never forgotten the taste. Before her fork could reach the plate, Isabella's own fork shot out and pinned Sophia's wrist lightly to the table. "Sophia," Isabella said, low enough that it wasn't quite a public announcement, but loud enough that at least 6 people nearby clearly heard it, a small smile playing at the corner of her mouth. "Don't eat so much. You didn't contribute a single dollar to this dinner, so maybe show a little restraint for the people who are actually paying for it." The words landed in Sophia's chest like a stone dropped into still water, a small sound, an enormous ripple. Eleanor, rather than looking confused or defending her younger daughter, simply smiled and nodded in agreement. "Family is about knowing how to carry your share, Sophia," she said lightly, reaching for her own wine glass. "You should learn a thing or two from your sister." Sophia set her fork down. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. In the years since she'd left home for college, she had learned, slowly, painfully, through 100 small moments, just like this one, that explaining herself in front of her family rarely accomplished anything except giving them a new opportunity to diminish her further. Arguments in this family were never really about facts. They were about who could perform hurt more convincingly, and Isabella had always been better at performance than Sophia could ever hope to be. She sat for another moment, feeling the warmth drain slowly out of the room even as the string quartet continued playing something gentle and unbothered in the corner, oblivious to what had just happened 6 feet away from them. Then, calmly, without a word to anyone at the table, Sophia rose from her chair. "Sophia," her father said, glancing up from his plate for the first time in several minutes, something like concern flickering briefly across his face before settling back into its usual neutral distance. "Where are you going?" "I need some air," she said simply, and reached for the cream-colored coat draped over the back of her chair. No one else at the table said anything. Isabella had already moved on, laughing at something her boyfriend said, holding court once more at the head of the table she had claimed for herself without ever having paid for a single flower on it. Sophia walked out of the private dining room, down the long timber-beamed hallway of the lodge, past floor-to-ceiling windows where snow continued to drift silently down over the mountains, and into the resort's main lobby, where fire crackled in a stone half the size of a small car. At the concierge desk, she found Marcus, the event manager, who had worked with her for 4 months on every detail of the evening, a tall man in his 40s with the kind of unflappable calm that seemed to be a prerequisite for managing weddings and milestone celebrations for people with more money than patience. "Marcus," Sophia said, her voice steady, "I need to make a change to tonight's billing." Marcus looked up from his tablet, immediately reading something in her expression that made him set the device down and give her his full attention. "Of course. What do you need?" "Cancel the authorization on my card for the remaining balance," Sophia said. "I'll accept the loss of my $3,000 deposit, that's fine, that's mine, I don't want it back. But everything else, the remaining balance for tonight, I want the final invoice sent directly to the woman sitting at the head of that table. Isabella Miller." Marcus's eyebrows lifted, just slightly, the only crack in his professional composure. "The full remaining balance." "The full remaining balance," Sophia confirmed. "Every course, every bottle, the musicians, all of it. Send it to her." "May I ask," Marcus said carefully, "if there's anything else you'd like us to do? Anything you need from us tonight?" Sophia considered this for a moment, looking back down the hallway toward the muffled sound of laughter still drifting from the private dining room. "No," she said finally. "Just do that. And please, don't tell anyone in that room what's about to happen. Let it happen naturally." Marcus nodded slowly, something that might have been the beginning of a small, professional smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Understood, Ms. Miller. Consider it done." Sophia thanked him, pulled her coat tighter around herself, and walked out through the lodge's heavy front doors into the falling snow, leaving her mother's 60th birthday dinner behind her without a single glance back. Back in the private dining room, the evening continued exactly as Isabella had orchestrated it. She held court through the appetizer course, narrating for the table, inaccurately, extensively, the months of planning that had gone into the evening, describing conversations with the chef that had never happened, describing a vision board she claimed to have built for the flowers, describing, at one particularly audacious point, the special trip she had supposedly taken to personally select the wine. Eleanor beamed through all of it, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with her napkin, telling Isabella how touched she was, how lucky she was to have a daughter who understood the meaning of family the way Isabella so clearly did. No one asked where Sophia had gone. No one, apparently, had particularly noticed. By the time dessert arrived, the chocolate-taught Sophia had spent an entire weekend perfecting from her grandmother's recipe, though of course no one at the table knew that either. Marcus reappeared at the entrance to the private dining room, carrying a slim leather folder under one arm. He approached the head of the table with the composed, unhurried gait of a man who had delivered difficult news to wealthy people many times before, and set the folder down gently in front of Isabella. Marcus said, his voice pleasant and entirely professional, "Miss Sophia Miller has cancelled her payment authorization for this evening. The remaining balance for dinner, the premium wine selection, and the service fees comes to $12,000. If you could settle that now, we can close out the evening." The table went quiet. Isabella's face, which had been glowing with the warm confidence of someone accustomed to being applauded, drained of color in real time, a transformation so complete and so sudden that several guests actually gasped audibly. There must be some mistake," Isabella said, laughing nervously, glancing around the table as though waiting for someone to explain that this was clearly some kind of misunderstanding. "I thought this was maybe a few $100s, at most." "The final total is $12,000, Marcus repeated, his tone unchanged, not including the $3,000 deposit that has already been forfeited. Isabella fumbled in her small evening clutch, producing a credit card with visibly shaking hands, and held it out to Marcus, who politely stepped aside to allow the resort's card reader to be brought tableside. The machine beeped once, twice, and then displayed a single word in bright red letters that everyone at the table, craning to see, could read clearly: declined. That can't be right," Isabella stammered, her voice rising an octave. "Try it again." It was declined a second time. As it turned out, and as Marcus gently, almost apologetically explained when Eleanor demanded to know how the bill had ballooned so dramatically, Isabella had, at some point during the planning stages, quietly called the resort's kitchen directly and instructed them to upgrade the truffle course to the most expensive variety available, and to add 5 additional bottles of a rare vintage wine to the evening's service, apparently under the assumption that Sophia, whom she had never once thanked, credited, or even acknowledged as the actual host, would simply absorb the cost without question, the way she always had. While Isabella sat frozen, staring at the declined card in her trembling hand, a slow, deliberate voice cut through the stunned silence of the table. "Before we all rushed to help Isabella settle this bill," Samuel said, not raising his voice, not needing to, "perhaps she should explain something else to the rest of us." Every head at the table turned toward the far end, where Samuel had been sitting quietly all evening, watching, as he always did, more than he spoke. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and withdrew his phone, an old model, one his grandchildren teased him about regularly, though tonight no one was laughing. "A few weeks ago," Samuel continued, his voice calm and unhurried, the voice of a man who had spent 84 years learning that the truth needed no embellishment to land with full force, "I received a message on this thing my grandson insists I keep installed. Something called Venmo." He turned the phone around so the table could see the screen, then slowly began passing it hand to hand down the length of the table. "It was a request for $300, Samuel said, with a note attached. "Contribution for Mom's party. I imagine most of you received the exact same request. I imagine most of you paid it." A murmur rippled down the table as several guests exchanged uneasy glances, a few nodding slowly, a few reaching for their own phones as if to check. "Isabella," Samuel said, turning to look directly at his granddaughter for the first time all evening, his eyes sharp despite his age. "Would you care to explain why you asked 20 different people at this table to each contribute $300 toward a dinner that, as we have just learned, quite publicly, thanks to Marcus here, you did not actually pay for?" Isabella's mouth opened, then closed. No sound came out. "I have the screenshots," Samuel added, almost gently, setting his phone down on the table in front of him, "if anyone would like to see them. Every message. Every request. Word for word." The table erupted, not in applause this time, but in a low, furious wave of realization. Aunt Diane, seated near the middle of the table, pulled out her own phone with visible outrage, scrolling to find the exact message Samuel had described. "I paid this," she said, her voice sharp with disbelief. "I paid this 3 weeks ago. I thought I was helping pay for Sophia's dinner." "We all did," another cousin chimed in. "She told me it was for the whole party fund." Isabella had not simply taken credit for a $15,000 gift she had no part in planning or paying for. She had gone further. She had quietly solicited money from nearly every relative in the room, framing it as a shared family contribution to her mother's celebration, and had pocketed every dollar of it, while simultaneously ordering thousands of dollars in additional luxury items she fully expected her actual sister to pay for without complaint. Eleanor, who had spent the entire evening glowing with pride at her elder daughter's supposed generosity, now sat utterly still, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth, her face slowly shifting from confusion to something far more painful to watch, the dawning, undeniable recognition that she had spent the last 2 hours praising the wrong daughter, and dismissing the right one, in front of everyone she knew. Eleanor and Robert arrived at Sophia's apartment in Manhattan on a Sunday afternoon in early spring, nearly 2 months after the dinner in Aspen, having called ahead, something Sophia noted with quiet appreciation, since it was a small, but real acknowledgement that they no longer assumed automatic access to her time and attention. Sophia opened the door to find her mother standing in the hallway looking smaller somehow than Sophia remembered, her usual polish slightly dimmed, her hands twisting together, in a way Sophia had never seen from her before. Robert stood a half-step behind, holding a bouquet of peonies, the same variety, Sophia realized with a small jolt, that she'd flown in from California for the Aspen dinner. Someone, evidently, had finally been paying attention. "Can we come in?" Eleanor asked, her voice smaller than Sophia had ever heard it. Sophia stepped back and let them into her apartment, the same restrained, considered space she designed for everyone else's homes, but had somehow never quite gotten around to fully furnishing in her own, as though some part of her had never fully believed she deserved the same care she gave to strangers. They sat in the living room, an uncomfortable silence stretching between the three of them, for a long moment before Eleanor finally spoke. "I don't know how to say this in a way that sounds like enough," Eleanor began, her hand still twisting in her lap, "but I need to try. I spent that entire dinner, the dinner you built, every single detail of it, for me, praising your sister for something she didn't do. And when she humiliated you, right in front of me, right in front of everyone, I agreed with her. I told you to learn something from her." Her voice cracked slightly on the last words. "I have spent 60 years, Eleanor continued, somehow always assuming that the daughter who made noise was the one who cared more, and the daughter who stayed quiet simply didn't need as much from me. I never once stopped to ask whether that quiet was actually contentment, or whether it was just you, protecting yourself from a family that kept teaching you, over and over, that speaking up wasn't safe." Sophia sat very still, listening, feeling something in her chest that had been clenched tight for as long as she could remember begin to loosen, just slightly, at the edges. "I'm not asking you to pretend this didn't happen," Eleanor said. "I'm asking if there's any way you'll let me try to be better at seeing you. Actually seeing you, not just assuming I already understand you because you've never given me trouble." Robert, uncharacteristically, spoke next, setting the peonies down on the coffee table between them. "I should have said something at the table," he said quietly. "That night, and honestly, 4 years before it, I always told myself that staying out of it was the same as being fair to both of you. It wasn't. It just meant I let whoever was loudest win, every single time. I'm sorry, Sophia. That's on me." Sophia looked between her parents for a long moment, feeling the weight of 30 years pressing against the weight of this single, imperfect, genuine attempt at repair. "I accept the apology," she said finally, her voice steady. "Both of your apologies. I mean that. Eleanor's shoulders sagged with visible relief, and she reached for Sophia's hand. "But I need you to understand something too," Sophia continued, gently withdrawing her hand, not out of coldness, but because she needed the space to say what came next with her own steadiness intact. "For most of my life, I thought that being quiet, being generous, never asking for credit or acknowledgement, was the same thing as being a good daughter. I thought that if I just kept giving my time, my money, my patience, eventually it would be enough to earn the kind of attention Isabella got just by asking for it loudly." She paused, looking at both of her parents in turn. "I know now that was never going to work, because silence isn't the same thing as generosity. It's just silence. And I let people mistake it for something else for a long time, partly because it was easier than the alternative. That's going to change. Not because I'm angry, I'm not anymore, not really. But because I finally understand that the only way to actually be seen in this family is to say something, clearly, when it matters. I'm not going to buy recognition with money or effort anymore. If I want to be acknowledged, I'm going to ask for it. Directly, out loud." In the weeks that followed, Sophia found herself thinking often about the space between silence and speech, the years she had spent believing that patience, generosity, and restraint were virtues to be practiced quietly, without acknowledgement, almost as though visibility itself were a kind of vanity she needed to guard against. She thought about all the times she had absorbed a small unfairness rather than name it, the childhood birthdays overshadowed by Isabella's tears when she didn't get enough attention, the years of Eleanor's casual comparisons, the countless family dinners where Sophia's accomplishments were mentioned briefly, almost as an afterthought, before the conversation swiveled back toward whatever Isabella was currently doing that required an audience. She had told herself, for years, that this was simply who she was, the quiet one, the reliable one, the one who didn't need the spotlight. And there had been truth in that. Sophia genuinely didn't crave attention the way Isabella did, didn't need a room full of people watching her to feel like her achievements were real. But somewhere along the way, that genuine preference for quiet had curdled into something else. A habit of accepting mistreatment simply because naming it out loud felt more uncomfortable than absorbing it in silence. Aspen had changed something in her, not because of the dramatic unraveling at the dinner table. She hadn't even been present for that part, hadn't orchestrated it, hadn't wanted it, really, beyond the simple desire not to be the one left holding a bill for someone else's dishonesty. What had changed her was the walk out through the lobby, the conversation with Marcus, the simple, unfamiliar act of saying, clearly and without apology, "This is not fair, and I am not going to absorb the cost of it." It had been such a small thing, in the moment. Cancel a card, redirect an invoice. And yet it had cracked something open that 30 years of quiet endurance never had. Sophia and Isabella did not become close in the months that followed. That kind of repair, Sophia understood, would take far longer than a single public apology could accomplish, if it happened at all. But they did, slowly, begin speaking again, carefully, in the measured way of two people rebuilding something on ground that had proven far less stable than either had assumed. Isabella called her, unprompted, on a Tuesday evening in early summer. "I've been in therapy," Isabella said, without preamble, her voice lacking its usual polish. "Since Aspen, actually. My therapist keeps asking me why I needed the whole family to think I'd done something I hadn't, and I don't have a good answer yet. But I'm trying to find one." Sophia listened, saying little, letting her sister talk. "I think," Isabella continued, haltingly, "I think I always assumed that if I wasn't the one everyone was talking about, I wasn't really anyone at all. And you were always so, I don't know, complete, somehow, without needing anyone to notice. It made me feel like I had to take up more space, just to exist at all." It wasn't a full explanation, and it certainly wasn't an excuse. Sophia was careful, in her own mind, not to let it become one. But it was, she thought, a genuine attempt at honesty, the first one she could remember, her sister offering in longer than she could recall. "I don't need you to be smaller for me to feel like I exist," Sophia said finally. "I never did. I just needed you to stop taking things that weren't yours." "I know," Isabella said quietly. "I'm working on it." It wasn't resolution, exactly, but it was a beginning, an honest one, which was more than Sophia had expected, and more, perhaps, than she'd once believed her family capable of offering her at all. Sophia hosted Eleanor's 61st birthday quietly, in her own apartment, with a small dinner for 6, her parents, her grandfather, a family friend Eleanor had known since college, and at Sophia's own invitation, Isabella. There was no $15,000 production this time. No flown-in flowers, no string quartet, no restored photographs lit by brass picture lamps. Sophia cooked the meal herself, a simpler version of some of the dishes from the Aspen dinner, and when Eleanor asked, halfway through dessert, whether Sophia had made the chocolate torte from her own grandmother's old recipe, Sophia said yes, and told the story of the weekend she'd spent perfecting it, out loud, at the table, without waiting to be prompted, without worrying that claiming the effort made her seem as though she were asking for too much. "It's wonderful," Eleanor said, and this time, when she reached across the table to squeeze her daughter's hand, there was no comparison folded quietly into the gesture, no unspoken suggestion that someone else deserved equal or greater credit. Samuel, seated at the far end of the table as he always seemed to be, watched the whole exchange with the same quiet attention he brought to everything, a small, satisfied smile settling into the deep lines of his face. "You know," he said to Sophia later, as the others cleared plates in the kitchen and the two of them sat alone by the window, watching the city lights flicker on below, "I've watched a lot of people in this family confuse loudness with strength, over the years. Your sister included. It took me a long time to teach your father the difference, and I'm not sure I ever fully managed it." "And me?" Sophia asked. Samuel considered the question for a moment, the way he considered most things, slowly, thoroughly, without rushing toward an answer simply to fill a silence. "You already understood the difference," he said finally. "You just needed to learn that quiet strength still has to open its mouth sometimes. Strength that never speaks just looks like surrender, to people who aren't paying close attention. And most people," he added, with the faint, dry humor that had carried him through 84 years, "aren't paying nearly as much attention as they think they are." Sophia smiled, looking out at the lights of the city she'd built her whole adult life in, far from Aspen, far from the dinner table where she'd once quietly set down her fork and walked out into the snow. She thought about all the years she had spent believing that her worth lived entirely in what she gave without asking for anything back, the dinners paid for silently, the credit ceded without complaint, the corrections left unspoken, because speaking them felt more dangerous than swallowing them. She understood now that the truest form of generosity had never required her own erasure. That love, given honestly, didn't need to hide the hand that gave it. That the quietest people in a room were not always the weakest, but that even the quietest voice, eventually, had to be willing to say, clearly and without apology, "This is what I did, and it mattered." Somewhere behind her, in the kitchen, she could hear Isabella laughing at something her father had said, a real laugh, unpolished, unperformed, nothing like the careful, camera-ready version Sophia had grown up watching her sister construct for an audience. Maybe that was changing too, slowly, the way most real things changed, not all at once, not dramatically, but one honest moment at a time. Sophia turned back toward the window, toward the quiet, steady lights of the city stretching out below her, a city that had never once needed her to explain herself in order to recognize what she'd built. She had built this life the same way she built every room she designed, carefully, deliberately, with an eye for what mattered even when no one else noticed it right away. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt no need at all to apologize for taking up exactly the space she deserved.